like Charlotte said, I'm going to focus predominantly on the Cannabis Social Club model in the UK. And there's no legal room for this model to exist in the UK, in contrast with other countries around the world. So in light of that, I've chosen today to adopt a political view of human rights. So I'm going to go into detail, explain what that is in a moment. And I'm going to show how this view could highlight the power dynamics in the UK's drug policy making process. And I'm going to try and show you how an awareness of existing power structures here has the potential to help the UK's Cannabis Social Club movement, so the UKCSC movement, to try and influence reform in the direction that they want. So first of all, though, what actually is a Cannabis Social Club? So a Cannabis Social Club, or a CSC, involves a group of adult members that organise the cultivation of a limited amount of cannabis to try and satisfy their own personal needs, to avoid them then having to turn to the black market. So what you have here then is a closed non-for-profit circuit between the people who produce cannabis and the people who then consume cannabis. And with these models, certain requirements are also met concerning health, safety, transparency and accountability. They're also usually legally registered associations, and there's often a dialogue as well between the club and the authorities. They're also usually grassroots, bottom-up initiatives that started out with citizens actively demanding change, and that's what really initially appealed to me about the model. And in an article that this presentation is based on, I've given a detailed overview of how cannabis social clubs have emerged internationally. So, for example, in Spain and in Belgium, the model emerged from the grassroots, where cannabis activists would engage in a dialogue with MPs, with judges, academics, members of the social services, and other influential authorities. And this helped to informally legitimise the model. Although very recently it's gone even further than that in Spain. You might be aware that a couple of days ago, Catalonia, an autonomous region in Spain, has just legalised and fully regulated cannabis social clubs for the first time. And that includes the cultivation, consumption and the distribution of cannabis. So that's what separates out this autonomous region from other autonomous regions in Spain that have also got similar legislation. And in Uruguay as well, even though the cannabis law that was implemented in 2013 came from the top down, the CSC model, it wouldn't be a legal regulatory model at all if it weren't for cannabis social movements at the time calling for it. So the model, in fact, over there did result as well from a mixture of top-down and bottom-up forces. Other Latin American countries, they were quite interesting because they've drawn specifically on human rights arguments to not prosecute people for consuming cannabis. That's what happened in court cases in Argentina and in Colombia. And more drastically, as Charlotte's already mentioned, in Mexico, the Supreme Court ruled in 2015 that prohibiting 4 people from a cannabis society from consuming cannabis for their own personal use would violate a number of human rights relating to this principle of human dignity. They drew on, obviously, the argument to self-create, the free development of one's own personality, rights to personal identity, etc. And again, you know, the South African judgment is another big one in this area as well, very recently ruled that is an infringement on the human right to privacy to ban the cultivation and possession of cannabis, providing it's done in your own home. So you can see then that employing this natural law view of human rights where activists go through the court process, it has been successful in some jurisdictions, whereas other countries like Spain, Belgium, Uruguay, they've had to rely on grassroots initiatives and engagement with political processes. So I wanted to see then if it's possible to try and combine these two approaches to see if the UK's Cannabis Social Club movement could legalise or go some way towards legitimising their model from the grassroots up, despite the fact that there's no legal room for manoeuvre in the UK. And just as an important aside, really, I sort of realised I would have to adopt this broader political view of human rights, because adopting a natural law view of human rights, as Charlotte's already alluded to, has been quite unsuccessful in the UK, in contrast with sort of the Latin American court cases and the South African case that you're seeing now. Because all the cases in the UK so far where cannabis users have gone through the court to try and challenge the prohibition of cannabis just show that the courts defer to the Parliament or to the executive in politically sensitive areas, and they largely fail to engage at all with the human rights of cannabis consumers. And if they do engage at all, they will just justify these infringements by using the qualifiers, so like the qualifiers under Article 8.2. And I think that, especially given the UK's current political climate, the courts are likely to continue to take this approach. Although, of course, we do have the All-Parliamentary Group for Drug Policy Reform, like Charlotte was mentioning. We are starting to recognise human rights a bit more in this country. But I think that human rights and politics are very much mutually intertwined here. And according to Goodhart, human rights claims are in fact political in the broadest sense, as they're normative claims about how the world should be. He says that to invoke human rights is to challenge the natural order of things, to confront structures of power and privilege with the unshakable belief in freedom and equality for all. And research in the development sphere in particular acknowledges this, as a human rights-based approach to development recognises that the process for implementing human rights is actually a very political one. And this approach, what I like about it is it mirrors the structure of the CSC model to a certain extent, as it does look at ways that activists can implement their human rights from the bottom up. So Andreasen and Crawford, who are academics that work in this human rights-based approach to development sphere, have stated that by putting power back at the centre of analysis and by recognising struggles for rights as political struggles, then rights-based approaches could not only secure progress in realising rights, but also strive for structural change, where the balance of power is tilted away from powerful elites and towards the mass of rights-deprived people. They also noted that there needs to be an awareness of these power relations before any strategies can be adopted then to go about and try and challenge them. So it's through this particular lens of human rights that I'm wanting to explore the power dynamics in British drugs policy and try and see how these power structures relate to cannabis activists and relate to the Cannabis Social Club model in the UK, before then going on to look at strategies to try and challenge the status quo. Okay, so a member of the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs, he's also a professor at the University of Kent, Alex Stevens, said that drug policy reflects and reproduces social inequalities between social groups. It involves the imposition of power by some groups of people over others. And going on, following on from this statement, he considered that the set of actors at the centre of British drug policy making could be thought of as a medico-penal constellation. And he used this term to describe a group of people that don't necessarily share the same core moral beliefs about drug policy, but nevertheless they share social connections and social proximity. And he says that the medical establishment and law enforcement bodies have dominated this policy-making process. And these bodies that non-exhaustively comprise of public health professionals, doctors, the Home Office, civil servants, the police. He says that all of these bodies together, they help to legitimise a social control agenda. And you can see that really clearly in the narrative that we confer upon drug users. We tend to construe drug users as being bad or as being sick or as being both. So Stevens notes that notions of individual freedom and empowerment are very much on the periphery in the drug policy making field. And I think that an awareness of this shows just how unique the Cannabis Social Club model actually is, because the model brings this notion of individual freedom and empowerment right to the forefront, as its closed, not-for-profit, transparency and accountability aspects affords cannabis consumers the space and the capacity to make their own informed choices, to guide their own usage, and to develop this model on their own terms away from this dominant medico-penal constellation. So by adopting a political view of human rights then, you can see where the power currently exists and how the development of this model from the grassroots actually transfers power back to the drug consumer. And to give you a bit more detail on how the model does this, I'm going to offer a very basic overview on the development and the operation of the CSC model in the UK. So like I mentioned earlier, despite having no legal room for manoeuvre in the UK, in contrast with Spain, Belgium and Uruguay, since the possession of any amount of cannabis is criminalised here, the UKCSC actually has over 100 cannabis social clubs that are registered with them at the moment. There was a recent influx in clubs thanks to Vice and Unilad picking up on the activities that they were doing earlier this year. But far more clubs exist that are unregistered, and a lot of these clubs actually exist in for-profit, so quite separate to the UKCSC model. Whereas the UKCSC is an NGO platform that was founded in 2011, and what it does is it acts as an official association for collectives, clubs and affiliates that want to try and remove themselves from the black market. And although the majority of the clubs aren't engaging in collective cultivation, the handful that are have additionally registered as collectives. So they're then following these international models that I've talked to you about of communally growing and sharing cannabis in this closed non-for-profit setting. And to do this, the UKCSC have endorsed a tagged 9-plant collective model. And what they do is they offer tags for gardens that have up to 9 plants that are growing for personal or medical use and that are not being grown for profit or dealing. And they've done this because after examining the sentencing guidelines in the UKCSC have reasoned that the 9-plant limit will reduce any legal harms because the guidelines, the sentencing guidelines, outline that 9 plants is not considered to be a commercial scale operation. So in theory, at least, it shouldn't carry a prison sentence. And as far as the tagging goes, just to explain that in a bit more detail, each plant would have a loose tag around it with its own unique serial number, and that's then recorded by the individual Cannabis Social Club on a tagged record sheet. And a small fee, so a £5 fee for each tag, is then paid to the UKCSC via the CSCs that are engaging in collective cultivation. And this tag record sheet would also record, say, the wet weight of the plant, the dried weight, the strain of the plant, and also by tagging the plants correctly, the UKCSC could then help you and could then assist with any legal aid or representation at court in the event that there are any police raids of these individual collectives. At the moment, there hasn't been any police raids for clubs or collectives that are affiliated with the UKCSC, but there's been a couple of raids for the clubs that are existing for profit, that are existing separate to the UKCSC. And some of the UKCSC collectors are even starting to implement a £1 tax per gram as well to help assist with legal aid, and also to eventually cover the costs of going on and developing and setting up their own clubhouse. So you can see then that the UKCSC have formalised their setup to a large extent. They've got a detailed regulatory framework, and they're trying to address vulnerabilities from law enforcement bodies to try and legitimise the movement as far as is possible to do in the UK. Of course, it's one thing though to develop an awareness of these dominant power relations in the drug policy making field and to try and understand your position within that. But as Crawford and Andreasen have noted, to really try and understand and appreciate how effective a rights-based approach is, you need to then look at the extent to which organisations can use it to challenge the power structures and the inequalities that exist. So there's 3 main strategies then that grassroots development organisations have adopted to try and address these unequal power relations. So they look to collaborate and cooperate with public authorities. They look to try and build alliances with other non-governmental organisations, and they also confront power holders such as the state. And I think it's important to look at how the UKCSC can apply this political view of human rights then by employing these 3 strategies. So a notable example of the UKCSC cooperating with public authorities involves members of their clubs in the North East meeting up with the Police and Crime Commissioner of County Durham, Ron Hogg. And after meeting with these activists, Hogg ended up reprioritising the structure of cannabis policing in the North East of England. So in 2015, he released a statement which said that cannabis policing should be about keeping people out of the criminal justice system and reducing costs. It's about being more productive with the way that we approach things. He also said that we are not prioritising people who have a small number of cannabis plants for their own personal use. So you can imagine that this statement was widely reported in the media at the time, and it also resulted in other police and crime commissioners from across the UK, so in Surrey, Devon, Avon and Somerset, and in North Wales, adopting a similar stance. So the possession and cultivation of cannabis is effectively decriminalised in County Durham as a result then of the UKCSC movement cooperating with and strategically aligning their reform agenda with the police. I think another way to challenge these prevailing power constellations then is to build alliances as well with NGOs and other interested parties. So I've noted in my paper that this presentation is based on that drug policy researchers could start to adopt participatory methodologies more. And this should allow drug user movements like the UKCSC to actually have an element of control over the research process itself. And I think that this could then go on to help dismantle this dominant narrative and the inherent power inequalities that you often find in evidence-based policy. So although so many drug policy advocates call for evidence-based policy, and of itself that is really important, it's essential, I think it's also worthwhile thinking very carefully about who actually gets to speak with any real authority here, because it's largely the dominant powers in the medico-penal constellation that actually have a voice here. So I think we need to start drawing on other examples to look at ways to try and dismantle this dominant narrative. So one example of where participatory methodologies were used was via the Worldwide Weed Research Team. And what they did is they gave small-scale cannabis growers around the world the opportunity to offer feedback on their growing practices in a code book. So this then facilitated the active agency in the research process. I also think the UKCSC could look to build alliances with the media and with other cannabis activist groups who are calling for change, though the UKCSC are wary of some groups that might have vested commercial interests. And they appreciate that while there is a place for a medical or a commercial model, not everyone can afford the cannabis that they need or be able to access a strain of cannabis that works best for them under these models. So the UKCSC addressed this concern then by confronting the state with the seminal issue of our freedom and the extent to which prohibitionist policies can impinge upon it, since their Right to Grow campaign unashamedly frames cannabis use as a human rights issue. And the UKCSC are implementing this new campaign, which looks at the right to grow, share and collectively consume cannabis. And at their AGM in November last year, a UKCSC member said, "We need to have the right to grow our own cannabis to our own standards of a strain of our choice, since without the right to grow, cannabis isn't really legal or free, it's simply a commercial exercise for corporations." And according to Tom de Court, who's a leading Cannabis Social Club researcher in Belgium, the desire to have more control over the production process and the final product has been a really key factor in this overall increase in localised, non-profit-driven cannabis cultivation. So you can see that the CSC model doesn't reduce consumers to a passive role in contrast with the black market, a commercialised market or a medical market. Rather, a rights-based stance here empowers users and facilitates their active agency in the legalisation process. So therefore, it confronts these deeply embedded power constellations that I've spoken to you about earlier. And when talking about their 9-plant collective model, the president of the UKCSC summed it up quite well. He said that we're not asking for permission to do this, we're taking it. But of course, the political landscape in the UK is quite inhospitable at present. You know, at one point, quite recently, Theresa May wanted to withdraw from the European Convention of Human Rights, and then in the run-up to the election, she changed her mind on that and wanted to introduce derogations, so who knows what she's wanting to do there. And we've become even more authoritarian as well with our drug policy recently. You know, we've introduced the Psychoactive Substances Act in 2016. Nevertheless, though, I think that confronting the state by developing and acting on their own clear regulatory framework is a really powerful strategy in itself. People all over the world, like Charlotte mentioned earlier, are acting as if the drug laws have already been reformed, whether that be through consuming controlled substances, selling them on the dark web, or even by setting up CSCs around the world by exploiting these legal loopholes. And according to Charlotte, in her paper, Psychedelic Self-Creation, Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights, combining insubordination and activism with legal change helps to stabilise new paradigms that have emerged organically. So to conclude then, I've looked at how bottom-up approaches to reform could be combined with this human rights perspective to try and develop this broader political view of human rights. And this view realises that there needs to be an awareness of coercive power relations, and that while this medico-penal constellation dominates the drug policy-making process in the UK, the CSC model is rather uniquely placed to challenge these power dynamics, given the amount of control that the model confers back to the cannabis consumer. And I also think if we were to take this line of reasoning to its zenith, then we can imagine the impact that it has on the formulation of drug policies more generally, since other drug user movements are now beginning to draw on the UKCSC's agentic approach to reform. For instance, the Psychedelic Society are looking to conduct psychedelic experience weekends, which involve the consumption of magic mushroom truffles, in regions where police and crime commissioners have deprioritised controlled substances. And I think that the psychedelic community, we're arguably unique in comparison with other drug user groups in terms of the privilege and the social capital that we have. So if this were to be combined with the UKCSC's experiential knowledge and with their developed regulatory model, then both movements could arguably become a greater force to be reckoned with. Ultimately, prohibition is rooted in the politics and culture of maintaining power and privilege. So by developing a regulatory model where power is devolved back to the individual and away from this medico-penal constellation, the UKCSC could start to and could begin to influence others to try and go beyond most strategies for reform. Since by adopting a political view of human rights, this presentation has shown how the UKCSC movement has the potential to go some way towards challenging these dominant political powers in drug policy design. Thank you.